Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex topics and arm you with the essential insights you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into a critically important and globally relevant topic, the evolving conversation around Muslim women's rights in modern society.
That's right. And our deep dive today is primarily guided by the Qur'an, Women and Modern Society by Asghar Ali Engineer, published back in 2005. It's a really foundational text, I think, offering a nuanced exploration of these, well, very complex issues.
And our mission today is pretty clear. We're here to navigate the historical, the theological, and the social dimensions of women's status in Islam, specifically as presented in this book. We'll be extracting key insights, looking at diverse interpretations, and really trying to get into the nuances of this ongoing debate. Importantly, we're doing this without taking sides. We're just bringing you the knowledge from the source material itself.
Exactly. And what's truly compelling here, I think, is how this discussion isn't just theoretical. Not at all. It's a living reality. The author really highlights the profound impact of increasing education and awareness among Muslim women globally. This whole process of modernization is prompting crucial discussions about their rights. You even see it in historically conservative regions like, say, Saudi Arabia. Women there are actively debating and, demanding more freedom and representation. It's quite a powerful shift that's happening.
Right. So to really grasp this evolution, we probably need to start at the beginning, at the bedrock, the foundations of Islamic law itself. Let's talk about Sharia. For anyone needing a quick refresher, how should we understand Sharia in this particular context?
Sure. So Sharia is fundamentally the manifestation of Islamic beliefs, and it forms a significant element in the legal systems of most Islamic countries. But here's, I think, the key insight the author brings out. While it's deeply rooted in social structures, it's not presented as some static entity. It has, in fact, evolved over time.
That's a really crucial point, that it's not static. So if Sharia has evolved, what are the core sources that actually guide its formation? These are often referred to as the principles of Tashri', right?
Yes, the principles of Tashri', which basically means legislation or lawmaking in Islam. It guides how Sharia is actually formulated. The book outlines four main sources. First, obviously, there's the Qur'an itself, seen as the divine revelation. It provides the core principles, the values, the guidelines. However, a fascinating aspect here is that understanding its meaning can really depend heavily on language nuances, and also on whether certain verses are considered allegorical, the mutashabihat.
Interesting. Okay, and what's the second foundational source then?
The second is the Sunnah. This comprises the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad, and this is where it gets, well, really interesting, because the author dives into the controversies around the authenticity and compilation of hadith. Hadith are the written records of the Sunnah, you see. Thousands of these hadith emerged after the Prophet's death, and some are critically viewed, even termed spurious.
That raises a pretty important question then. How do scholars even begin to determine what's spurious in such a vast collection? What kind of criteria are applied? And is that process itself, universally accepted?
Well, that's a deeply debated point, and the book definitely underscores its complexity. Scholars use rigorous methodologies. They examine the chain of transmission, the isnad, and check the content's alignment with the Qur'an, and with reason. But no, the process isn't universally accepted, not at all. This leads to different schools of thought prioritizing different hadith, which then, of course, informs diverse interpretations of Sharia. It's complex.
Fascinating. So there's a constant sort of vetting happening even within these historical sources. What about the other two sources of Islamic law?
Right. The third is ijma, or consensus. This refers to the collective agreement of the community, or more often the scholars. While it was historically significant, its concept and application are, well, profoundly debated today. The book notes some modern thinkers entirely reject its relevance in contemporary Islamic legal thought.
Really? Reject it entirely?
Some do, yes, according to the text. And the fourth source is qiyas, which is analogical reasoning. This is used to derive rulings for new issues, basically by drawing parallels with existing ones found in the Qur'an or Sunnah.
Okay, so we have these four core sources, but then there's this pivotal debate mentioned in the book, immutability versus evolution. This isn't just some academic discussion, is it? It seems like the heartbeat of how Islamic law evolves or perhaps stagnates, especially when it comes to women's rights. Can you elaborate on that?
Precisely. You've hit it right there. On one side, you have traditional interpretations that often consider Sharia immutable, static, unchanging. This leads to taqlid, which is essentially imitation of past rulings. And that approach, the book argues, can indeed stagnate legal development.
Right, just sticking to the old ways.
Exactly. But the real potential game changer, advocated by many modern scholars and highlighted in the book, is ijtihad. This means creative reinterpretation. It sees the Qur'an itself not as static, but as a dynamic text containing principles designed to evolve with the times.
So the idea is that the text itself allows for change.
That's the argument. The core insight here, presented by the author, is that for many, the very future of women's rights in Islam hinges on embracing this dynamic approach, treating Sharia not as a fixed, immutable structure, but as a corpus of adaptable laws responding to changing realities.
This crucial distinction between static and dynamic interpretation, it's not just theoretical, is it? It must have profoundly impacted how women's rights have evolved through history. So let's pivot now to that historical landscape and the modern push for change. What was the situation like for women in pre-Islamic society, the Jahiliyyah period?
In pre-Islamic or Jahiliyyah society, women generally held a much, much lower social status. It was a deeply patriarchal tribal structure. You had practices like female infanticide, though its prevalence is debated. Widows could be inherited like property in some tribes, and marriage contracts often lacked the woman's consent entirely. It was, frankly, quite a bleak picture for women in many respects.
And how did the Quranic revelations impact this status? Were they truly revolutionary, as sometimes claimed?
Well, the Quranic revelations undeniably brought significant improvements to women's status compared to that pre-Islamic baseline. Absolutely. They introduced rights and protections, previously unknown rights, to inheritance, property ownership, consent in marriage, for instance.
So definite improvements.
Definite improvements. However, the book points out that these changes weren't always revolutionary in establishing full equality, as we might understand it today. For instance, while the Quran declares equality of sexes in principle, you see this in verse 2.228, its full realization has, unfortunately, often been hampered by later interpretations and, importantly, the influence of prevailing sociocultural norms that already existed.
Okay, so if that's the historical backdrop, what does this all mean for modernization and women's rights movements today? How is this playing out on the ground?
Well, the increasing education and awareness among Muslim women globally, coupled with the broader influence of modernization, it's really fueled demands for greater rights and participation. If you connect this to the bigger picture, you see these pressures playing out powerfully in various countries. The book gives several examples.
Yeah, the book points to some fascinating developments, even in traditionally conservative regions. Where are we seeing this play out, for instance?
Well, take Saudi Arabia. A survey cited in the source revealed that Saudi women are significantly participating in 6 major fields. This includes worship and family duties, yes, but also things like education, private sector management, and social services. This real-world engagement is directly fueling active debate and demands for more freedom and rights within that context.
And Kuwait is another compelling case study the book highlights, isn't it, with voting rights?
It absolutely is. Educated Kuwaiti women agitated persistently for years and eventually gained voting rights. This was despite initial, very strong conservative opposition. It really demonstrates the power of consistent advocacy.
Right. And what about places like Malaysia or Indonesia?
In Malaysia, though it's considered a developed country, the text notes that conservative views still undeniably influence women's rights discussions and laws. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, you see a very high literacy rate among women and a robust network of institutions specifically catering to women's education. It's a different dynamic again.
And we also see efforts to enforce changes, like with divorce laws in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh.
That's right. The book mentions concerted efforts to enforce changes like the abolition of triple talaq, we'll probably get into that later, and restrictions on polygamy. And it highlights the significant, often grassroots role NGOs play in advocating for women's rights in these regions.
But despite these movements, these demands for change, the source points out persistent obstacles. What are the main ones identified?
Yeah, the book identifies the conservatism of some ulama, some religious scholars, and also political motivations as major obstacles. These forces often resist progressive reform efforts. Sometimes, the author suggests, this happens by creating a kind of deliberate information overload, flooding the discourse with contradictory or overly complex interpretations. The effect: it obscures the path to change and helps maintain the status quo.
That's a concerning tactic. Okay, let's dive now into some of the most sensitive and, frankly, hotly debated topics surrounding women's rights in Islam. Starting with a really tough one. The interpretation of Qur'an, verse 4.34, often linked to male authority and, controversially, wife-beating.
Yes, this is a profoundly contentious verse. It contains the phrase wadrabuhunna, which is often translated and historically interpreted by some to permit hitting or striking wives. However, the interpretations diverge dramatically. Some classical commentators, like the famous Tabari, did seem to take it more literally as physical discipline, within certain bounds they defined.
But that's not the only view.
Not at all. Many modern interpreters, the book cites Muhammad Asad as an example, argue strongly against physical harm. They might interpret wadrabuhunna as a symbolic gesture, a light tap, or even argue it means to separate from or leave them. The key point is they assert that physical violence fundamentally contradicts the overall spirit of justice and compassion in the Qur'an.
So the meaning really hinges on that single word, wadrabuhunna, and how it's understood in context. And what about the other terms in that verse, like qawam and nushuz? How do they fit in?
Precisely. The terms qawam, often translated as maintainers, protectors, or sometimes controversially as having authority over, and nushuz, meaning recalcitrance, rebellion, or disloyalty from the wife.
Yeah.
They also fuel this debate intensely. Well, interpretations of qawam feed into ideas about male roles and authority, while nushuz defines the situation where the actions in 4.34 might even be considered. But what's crucial here is that modern interpreters, as highlighted in the book, argue the Qur'an's overarching message promotes mutual respect and kindness between spouses. Therefore, they see violent interpretations of 4.34 as fundamentally contradictory to the text's broader ethical framework.
Given such vastly different interpretations of a single verse, how does the average Muslim woman navigate this, especially when it touches on something as deeply personal as her safety and dignity within a marriage?
That's really the heart of the challenge, isn't it? The book doesn't offer a direct answer on how individual women navigate it day to day, but it strongly implies that the lack of consensus among scholars and the persistence of these more traditional, potentially harmful interpretations can create immense vulnerability for women. It really underscores the urgent need, from the author's perspective, for a unified, rights-affirming reinterpretation that is widely disseminated and accepted.
That makes these ongoing debates even more critical. Okay, let's shift to another topic that generates a lot of discussion. The veil. This is another hugely debated issue for Muslim women globally, with so many different views.
It truly is. There's a significant divide. On one side, you have those who see the veil, whether it's called purdah, chador, burqa, hijab, khimar, jilbab. The terms vary as a divine commandment and essential part of faith. On the other side, you have those who view it more as a sociocultural artifact, perhaps historically relevant but not religiously mandated today, or even sometimes as an oppressive symbol in modern society. The spectrum is wide.
And what do the Quranic verses themselves actually say about it? Are the directives as clear-cut as some might believe?
Well, the key verses usually cited are Qur'an 24.31, which speaks of women lowering their gaze, guarding their modesty, and drawing their khimar, often translated as veil or head covering, over their bosoms, and also verse 33.59, which instructs the prophet's wives and believing women to draw their outer garments, jilbab, close around themselves when they go out, so they may be recognized and not harassed.
Okay, but how are those interpreted?
That's where the variation comes in. Interpretations vary hugely on what these verses actually require in practice. Does it mean covering the entire body, including the face, just the hair and body? Or does it simply mandate modest dress, the definition of which might vary culturally?
So, lots of debate there.
Absolutely. And the book brings in an interesting historical angle. It suggests that evidence points to more extensive forms of veiling becoming widespread primarily among the nobles and the wealthy in certain periods. This implies it might have functioned more as a sociocultural norm, perhaps a status symbol, rather than being understood initially as a strict religious injunction binding all women in the same way.
Interesting. So the argument presented is that the Qur'an itself advocates for modesty and dignity, but perhaps doesn't mandate a specific form of dress like mandatory veiling or confinement to the home.
That's the perspective the author explores, yes. It suggests the core principle is modesty and protection, but the specific manifestation, like the veil, might be more rooted in historical and cultural contexts than in a direct, unchanging divine command for all time.
Okay, this is really getting into the nuances. Let's tackle another common point, maybe even a misconception. The idea that a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's in Islam. How does the book unpack this?
Yes, that's a very, very common assumption. It's typically based on one specific verse in the Quran, 2.282. This verse deals with documenting financial transactions like debts, and it says to get two men as witnesses, or if not two men, then one man and two women, so that if one of them errs, the other can remind her.
Right, and that's often taken generally.
Exactly. Traditionally, this has often been interpreted as meaning a woman's testimony, in general, is worth half that of a man's, sometimes linked to assumptions about women being more emotional or forgetful. But the crucial insight here, driven by modern scholarship and highlighted in the book, is that this interpretation ignores the very specific context.
So it's not intended as a universal rule or some judgment on women's intellectual capacity.
Absolutely not, according to these modern interpretations. Scholars emphasize this verse specifically refers to financial contracts. It was revealed in a socio-historical context where women generally had limited experience and involvement in complex financial dealings. The reminding aspect might have been purely practical for that specific situation.
Okay, that makes sense.
They argue strongly that this verse does not imply any general defect in women's intellect or memory. And critically, they argue it should not apply to other types of testimony, especially not in criminal cases or what are known as hudud punishments. The book suggests its application should be restricted solely to the financial context mentioned.
That really reframes a deeply ingrained belief, showing how context is key. So what does this contextual approach mean for other complex areas, like, say, polygamy?
Polygamy is another area where context and, crucially, the conditions attached are absolutely key. The Qur'an does permit marrying up to 4 wives. That's stated in verse 4.3. However, and this is the absolute non-negotiable condition stressed in the same verse, this permission is granted only if the husband can treat all wives with perfect justice and equality.
Equal justice. And is that condition considered easy to fulfill?
Far from it. Many respected scholars, including classical commentators like Tabari and Razi, and also prominent modern thinkers like Maulana Umar Ahmad Usmani cited in the book, they interpret this condition of absolute justice as extremely difficult, perhaps even humanly impossible, to fulfill perfectly, especially regarding emotional equity.
So the condition itself acts as a major restriction.
Precisely. By implicitly setting such an incredibly high, arguably unattainable bar, the argument is that the Qur'an is essentially guiding towards monogamy as the ideal, or at least the most practical and just arrangement for most circumstances. Historically, the book notes, polygamy might have served a pragmatic purpose in early Islamic society, particularly with wars creating many orphans and widows needing support.
But less relevant today.
Well, the societal context has changed dramatically, and you see this reflected in modern legal reforms in many Muslim-majority countries, which are increasingly moving towards restricting or even abolishing polygamy altogether, reflecting this evolving understanding and societal needs.
Okay, let's turn now to divorce. What are the core Qur'anic principles around divorce? How do they compare to practices like triple talaq, which often cause so much hardship?
The Qur'an actually places a strong emphasis on reconciliation when it discusses divorce. It outlines a clear, considered process. It generally involves revocable divorce, meaning after a first or a second pronouncement of talaq, divorce, there's a waiting period called the iddah. This iddah serves specifically as a time for reflection, cooling off, and potential reconciliation between the spouses. The divorce only becomes final after this period, or after a third pronouncement.
So there's a process, a time for thought.
Exactly. And the Qur'an also stresses the importance of providing maintenance, nafaqah, for the divorced wife during and after the iddah. The whole spirit seems to be one of careful consideration, avoiding hasty decisions, and prioritizing the potential for reunion if possible.
Okay, so given that emphasis on process and reconciliation, where does the practice of triple talaq come in?
This is where the divergence becomes really stark and problematic. Triple talaq, as commonly practiced in some communities and recognized by some schools of law, involves a man pronouncing talaq 3 times in one single sitting. Often, this is considered to result in an immediate and irrevocable divorce, bypassing the waiting period and the chances for reconciliation outlined in the Qur'an.
That sounds completely different from the process you just described.
It is. And while some jurists, particularly from the historical Hanafi school, came to consider it legally valid, though perhaps sinful or disapproved of, many other scholars and modern reformers vehemently argue against it. They contend it goes directly against the spirit, the letter, and the procedure laid out carefully in the Qur'an. And it undeniably leads to significant hardship and injustice, particularly for women who can be left instantly divorced, often without proper support.
Right, you hear terrible stories.
Exactly. This discrepancy has fueled ongoing legal struggles in several Muslim countries to abolish or at least strictly regulate triple talaq through court judgments and legislation. The push is to bring divorce practices back in line with what they see as the Qur'an's more compassionate and just principles.
That really sounds like a clear example where later interpretations or practices might have diverged significantly from the original text's apparent intent. Okay, finally, let's touch upon Islam and family planning. This is obviously a very modern issue in many ways. How does religious thought, as presented in the book, approach it, especially when established interpretations might clash with contemporary needs or technologies?
Indeed. Modern social issues like family planning really highlight the need, the author argues, for a creative and responsive approach from religious thought. It requires moving beyond potentially rigid, maybe seemingly immutable dogmas inherited from the past. Within Islam itself, there are actually varying views on birth control and abortion. It's not monolithic. And it's interesting perhaps to contrast this with the stance of, say, the Catholic Church, which maintains a very strong opposition to most forms of contraception. Islam has historically shown more flexibility here.
So are there specific arguments for its permissibility within Islamic frameworks discussed in the text?
Yes, there are, and they are quite strong, drawing on broader Islamic principles. Many arguments emphasize human agency and intellect, gifts from God to be used responsibly. They focus on divine guidance towards responsible planning for the well-being of the family, the mother's health, and society as a whole.
As long as it doesn't violate other core principles.
Precisely. The key proviso is usually that it shouldn't violate other established Islamic principles. For example, the Qur'an explicitly prohibits infanticide, particularly killing children out of fear of poverty, verses 6.15 to 17.31. So methods must respect the sanctity of life. But methods before conception, or even very early termination in some interpretations, might be viewed differently. Historically, the book points out there's been discussion among classical jurists about azl, which is coitus interruptus or withdrawal. The fact that this was discussed and debated implies a historical precedent for considering methods to limit conception.
So it's not an entirely new idea in Islamic thought.
Not entirely. Furthermore, the text mentions that some respected jurists, like Imam Shafi'i, founder of one of the major schools of law, reportedly allowed measures to control population growth under certain circumstances. And it cites Imam Raqib as approving birth control. This demonstrates a certain flexibility and responsiveness within the tradition itself, allowing for consideration of family well-being.
Okay, so if we try to connect all these threads now, from Sharia sources, historical context, to specific issues like the veil, testimony, polygamy, divorce, family planning, what's the overall synthesis? What's the biggest takeaway for you, or for our listeners, from this exploration based on Engineer's work?
Well, I think what's truly fascinating, and what comes through strongly in the book, is that the understanding of women's rights in Islam is absolutely not static. It's presented as a constantly evolving dialogue, a dynamic interplay between the foundational religious texts, the crucial historical context in which they were revealed and interpreted, and the pressing, ever-changing needs of modern society. It's portrayed as a living, breathing tradition that is, or at least should be, capable of adaptation and reinterpretation.
So what does this imply for the future? Where does this ongoing dialogue lead, especially concerning women's rights within Islam?
This really raises a crucial point for the future, and it echoes the author's core argument. Asghar Ali Engineer makes a powerful appeal throughout the book for a dispassionate, intellectually honest reinterpretation of the Qur'anic ideals, particularly the ideals of justice, equality, and compassion, especially concerning gender relations.
And this isn't just an academic exercise?
No, not at all. The argument is that this reinterpretation is imperative. It's necessary to make Islamic law relevant, applicable, and truly just in contemporary society. It's about ensuring the tradition continues to uphold its deepest ethical values while adapting constructively to changing realities. I think this deep dive, drawing on Engineer's analysis, really shows us the immense scope and the urgent need for reinterpreting religious texts to align with evolving social realities, all while striving to uphold those core spiritual and ethical values.
That's a powerful conclusion. It leaves us with a lot to think about. And perhaps a final provocative thought for you, our listener. Considering these historical influences, the cultural context, the human element in interpreting religious texts over centuries, how much of what we often assume is absolute divine will might actually be shaped, consciously or unconsciously, by the prevailing social and cultural norms of a particular era? And if that's the case, what does this mean for future interpretations of justice and equality, not just within Islam, but within potentially any religious framework facing the modern world? Something to definitely ponder.